Okay,
Welcome.
fine. Right. Yep, my name is Jason James, and I run a charity based in London called the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. So obviously I'm very involved with things Japanese. And I am sitting in my living room in Cambridge. I will go down to London to the office later on, but 9 o'clock, I thought it'd be easier to start at home. And a lot of my interest in Keiichi Kurosawa, I will talk about as we go through. So I'll leave it at that in terms of the self-introduction at the moment.
Great.
So Keiichi Kurosawa was at Trinity College, Cambridge, which is why you are all interested in him, I think.
That's right.
He was at Trinity in the 1920s. And I'm going to talk about two main things. The first is his role in introducing early music or Baroque music to Japan. And by early music, obviously, I mean early Western music. And we're talking really about music which dates to pre-1750 or so. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I want to talk about is his contribution in helping Benjamin Britten when the composer Benjamin Britten visited Japan in 1956. Both Keiichi Kurosawa and his son Hiroshi were quite heavily involved with that visit. This is a very grainy photograph. I've only got about 6 photographs, so I'll just leave them on the screen. You'll get probably quite sick of them. But this is Keiichi Kurosawa on the right with his son Hiroshi on the left, and they are both playing types of recorder, as you can see. And my interest in this topic it partly came about because Keiichi Kurosawa founded a group which is called the Tokyo Madrigal Singers, or it's sometimes known as the Tokyo Madrigal Club. In Japanese, I think it's called Madrigal Singers. I came across this group many years ago. So I moved to Japan in 1983 for the first time to live. And this was my gap year before I went to university. And I by the way, was at Cambridge, but I was at King's, not Trinity. So apologies for that. But so I moved to Japan in 1983, and I had a choral scholarship at King's. So I was quite keen to do some singing when I was in Japan, and I was looking for a choir. And I saw an advertisement in the newspaper for something called the Tokyo International Singers. So I said to my employer at the time, oh, I'm thinking of joining this choir. And she said, oh, if you want to sing, I'll introduce you to a friend of mine. So she introduced me to Hiroshi Kurosawa, the son of Keiichi, and that's how I started singing in the Tokyo Madrigal Singers many years ago. Now, actually, Keiichi Kurosawa died in 1982. That was the year before I arrived in Japan, so I can't say that I ever met him, but it is him that I want to focus on today. Now, Keiichi Kurosawa's father was a man called Teijiro Kurosawa. He was born in 1875, and he was a very successful entrepreneur, basically. Japan was changing rapidly at this time. You'll recall 1868 was the date of the Meiji Restoration. Suddenly the West was flooding into Japan, and a lot of things were changing. And clearly Teijiro thought there were opportunities here. So he worked as an apprentice in his teens and saved up some money. And then he went to America in 1893, really just to sort of see what was going on and scout out opportunities or business ideas. And the idea that he came up with was that Japan was going to need typewriters. Everybody had typewriters in the business world in America. And I don't have a lot of detail about his activities, but I think what seems to have happened is that over the rest of the 1890s, after he returned from America, he started importing typewriters into Japan, but he was also working on developing a typewriter that could handle Japanese script, which is obviously quite complicated. But he was successful in doing that. So in 1901, he founded his company, Kurosawa and Company, and it became quite a substantial business. I don't know if it was headquartered in Ginza from the very beginning. I think it probably was. But at some point anyway, early in the 20th century, he bought a piece of land on Chuodori, the main street in Ginza, and that became the company headquarters. And Ginza at the time was very much a center of this new Western style culture. Most of the Ginza area was destroyed by a fire in 1872, and the whole thing was rebuilt, well, in more or less the current style with Western buildings. And as Kurosawa's business grew, he actually started manufacturing typewriters. He bought about 25 acres of land, so that's about 10 hectares, in Kamata in southern Tokyo, and built a factory there. In fact, there were only about 100 people working in this factory, so he didn't really need such a large plot of land, but clearly he was doing very well. And he was also influenced by the Garden City movement, which took off in the UK around the turn of the century. So as well as the factory, he built employee housing, gardens, sort of allotments for the employees to grow vegetables. There was a swimming pool, a nursery, and a primary school. And so this area actually became known as Kurosawa Mula, or the Kurosawa village. So you can imagine this family as classic wealthy industrialists. They've got their headquarters office on the main drag in Ginza, a big piece of land with the factory and all of these other facilities for workers. And I don't know where the family house was at this time, but certainly these days it's in Denyen-chofu, which is one of Tokyo's smartest residential districts, and is, I think, quite conveniently linked by train to Ginza as well. And Keiichi Kurosawa then was the eldest son of this man, Teijiro Kurosawa, and he was born in 1903. There's some possibility it was 1904, but I think it was 1903. And I'm not sure how the musical connections, or indeed the British connections, started, because Teijiro had been associated with the US. But it's clear that Keiichi studied the cello in his youth in Tokyo, and he must have been very good at it. So he moved to the UK in 1924, essentially to go and study his BA at Trinity. But before he went to Trinity, he spent a year studying at the Royal Academy of Music in London. So his main study was the cello. He also seems to have studied ballet dancing there. I mean, this was before the specialist ballet schools had been founded. So it seems that the music colleges actually taught classical ballet in those days. So anyway, he was there for a year, 1924 to 1925. And then he went up to Trinity to study a tripos that I think doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Moral Sciences. So he did his BA there between 1925 and graduated in 1928. And he was clearly a very talented musician, but what I'm not sure about is whether he was really a singer. While he was at the Royal Academy of Music, their records show that he got the bronze medal in the sight singing competition in 1924. So he was certainly a good sight reader, and I have no doubt he was an excellent musician. But the reason I'm slightly doubtful about whether he was really a singer is that when he was at Cambridge, his main activity seems to be playing the cello. And he played the cello in the Trinity College String Quartet. And later he was involved in organizing concerts, actually not just at Trinity, but through Cambridge more broadly. And if you go to the Trinity College magazine of December 1927, there's a reference to him. There's a list of notable figures within Trinity College in the magazine, a kind of who's who. And so Keiichi Kurosawa is listed in that group. And the comment about him is, can do anything but sing. So it's possible that that's ironic. Maybe he was a brilliant singer and they were just joking. But my guess is that actually he was a great cellist. He was a prize-winning sight reader. He could dance. He was actually a pretty accomplished artist. He drew the designs for his own concert programs. But I suspect that he did not have a particularly good voice and wasn't really a trained singer. Of course, there'd have been Trinity College Chapel Choir, where people would have been singing services every day. And a lot of those people, of course, Trinity was all male at this point, but a lot of those people probably had a background in church music before that. And this is a kind of training that Keiichi Kurosawa wouldn't have had. So I think he wasn't really a singer. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how Baroque music was gaining more interest in the UK at this time and in Cambridge specifically, because this was very much influential on Keiichi Kurosawa. So if you think about Baroque music, by which we're talking about roughly pre-1750 music, it kind of fell out of fashion, and there is a complicated story about how it came back into fashion. One of the key people was Mendelssohn, which is much earlier, but he famously put on a performance of Bach's Matthew Passion in Berlin in 1829, and that revived interest across Europe in Bach's large-scale choral works. Mendelssohn was actually Queen Victoria's favorite composer, so he was pretty influential in the UK. So there was that going on. The other thing in the background was that although things like madrigals were not being sung very much, there were quite a few long-standing societies that sang things like, well, madrigals, catches, glees, and some of those had been going for, since the 1700s, for instance. So there were kind of amateur groups singing this kind of music. And I better explain a little bit about what these kinds of music are. So the Tokyo Madrigal Singers is the group that Kurosawa founded. And I know that some of my listeners know what a madrigal is, but maybe not all of you do. A madrigal is an unaccompanied secular part, so non-sacred music, usually for between 4 and 6 voices. And it developed in Italy in the 16th century, but was then taken up in England. So most madrigals really are either Italian or English, and they tend to have been written between about 1550 and 1650, with the English ones peaking a bit later than the Italian ones. And a lot of madrigal writers were composers who were famous for other types of music, sacred music. So madrigal writers include in Italy people like Palestrina and Monteverdi, and in England people like Byrd, Gibbons, Tompkins, and Weelkes, all of whom are very well known for sacred music as well. So that's madrigals. A catch is a very specific type of song, which is a canon or a round, basically. So several singers sing the same thing with a time interval between them, and it's designed to fit together. And then there's a thing called a glee. A glee is a specifically English form of song, so it's a bit like a madrigal, but madrigals are usually for mixed voices, i.e. soprano, alto, tenor, bass, involving women as well, whereas glees are normally for all male groups, where the top line is often taken by a male alto or countertenor. And glees are quite a bit later, but they're quite similar in style to madrigals, so there tends to be a bit of crossover. So there are a number of these glee and madrigal groups that continued to sing this sort of music, all the way through the 19th century and before that. One of the best known ones was the Anacreontic Society, because their number, the Anacreontic Song, actually became the US national anthem. I don't know if you were aware of this, but the US national anthem is in fact an English part song. Obviously the words are different. Anyway, that group folded apparently because the Duchess of Devonshire attended one of their meetings and it was considered too bawdy. So there was a problem there. But there's another group called the Noblemen and Gentlemen's Catch Club, which is founded in 1761. And in fact, that's still going, and I'm a member of it. So there were these groups around, including some regional groups in places like Bristol. But other than that, there wasn't much sign of Baroque music going on in the UK until the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the key people at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was linked with Keiichi Kurosawa, is a man called Arnold Dolmetsch. So Dolmetsch came from a family of piano manufacturers in France. And he taught music at Dulwich College for a while, but basically his significant contribution was that he started to make copies of period instruments, harpsichords and recorders and this sort of thing. And he argued that Baroque music needed to be played on these original instruments. And he had quite a lot of children, and they all played Baroque instruments. And in 1925, he founded the International Dolmetsch Early Music Festival in Haslemere, which is now the Haslemere Festival. And this became a kind of place of pilgrimage for people who were interested in early music. And according to Hiroshi Kurosawa, that's Keiichi's son, Keiichi actually attended the very first Dolmetsch Early Music Festival in 1925. But it has to be said that Hiroshi's memory was sometimes, not always accurate. But I think it's almost certainly true that Keiichi Kurosawa attended at least one of these music festivals in Haslemere. And then in Cambridge, one of the key things was that in 1920, a performance was put on of the Purcell masque, The Fairy Queen. So it was put on actually by Boris Ord, I think, Boris Ord was at that point an undergraduate at Corpus Christi. He later became director of music at King's, and he's famous for his carol, Adam Lay Bounden, which traditionally occupies an early slot within the King's carol service. So he put on The Fairy Queen, and this then triggered the foundation of the Cambridge University Opera Society, which actually changed its name in 1924 to the Cambridge University Madrigal Society. So this was not really about La Traviata. This was early opera and early music. And so there was a lot of interest going on in the early 1920s in early music. And against that background, in Trinity College, the Trinity College Madrigal Society was founded in around 1923 and became a really big success. So it started off as just a group of friends singing in somebody's rooms. But by 1925, it was doing concerts in villages around Cambridgeshire and also in London. And in 1926, in the Trinity College magazine, it says that the College Madrigal group was contemplating a third visit to the Colosseum, which is described as a music hall in London, which they have made famous. Now, the Colosseum, as I'm sure many of you know, it's a very large venue in London. It's currently home to the English National Opera and Ballet. It's one of the largest music venues in London, even today, was probably second only to the Royal Albert Hall at this point. So for them to be giving concerts there is quite a big deal. In February 1928, the Trinity College Madrigal Society gave a radio broadcast, which again is quite impressive because the BBC was only started in 1922, so broadcasting was very much in its infancy. And actually the broadcast prompted a letter from a Trinity alumnus who was living near Salisbury. He'd obviously heard the broadcast, so he wrote, "I little thought, when I put up the first pair of telephones that had been seen in Cambridge, between the attics of H and L Old Court, that half a century later I should hear a Trinity Madrigal Club 120 miles off, almost as if they were in the same room in this little remote village." So they were making quite an impact, the Trinity College Madrigal Society, but there is no evidence that Keiichi Kurosawa was singing in it. And again, looking at your college magazine, there's a poem about the Trinity College Madrigal Society, which I will read in its entirety. This was published in December 1928 in the Trinity magazine. "Melbourne, Guildhall, Newnham, Thriplow and Earlscoln, Girton, Jesus, Linton, Bourne, this term have heard our moan. We sing a dozen madrigals, some folk songs and some shanties. The latter always shake the sides of grandmothers and aunties. The audiences in villages some pleasure can derive from canzonets by Morley, writ in 1595. When thirst assails us and we tire in madrigalian fashion, then Geoffrey Beaumont sits and sings of purple Persian passion. The president, DJ, presides in theory, but in fact, about his presidential aid, it's hard to be exact. Trevelyan is director, and he warbles Sally Brown and captivates the ladies with his sex-appealing frown. Hadfield is the turtle dove, who also keeps the treasure. The singing of his Rio Grande is a most uncommon pleasure. The secretary, RRF, does hosts of footling things with drawing pins and charabancs, advanced bookings, and sings. So that's the poem, and it gives us some idea of the range of music that was sung by the Trinity College Madrigal Club. There's not actually that much reference to madrigals in it, strangely. I think Morley's canzonets would count as madrigals. These were published in the 1590s. But the Song of Purple Persian Passion, which Geoffrey Beaumont was singing when they tired, certainly doesn't sound like a madrigal, and probably a Victorian or Edwardian solo song. Sally Brown and Rio Grande, which are mentioned, are both sea shanties. And then the Turtle Dove, which I'm sure some of you will know, must be the Vaughan Williams setting of the Turtle Dove, which was actually published in 1924, so almost exactly this time. And Vaughan Williams, by the way, was also an alumnus of Trinity College, so there was a natural connection there. And this repertoire is somewhat similar to the repertoire that the Tokyo Madrigal singers have always sung. The core is madrigals, but they do actually sing. I mean, I myself have often sung the solo in the Turtle Dove for them, largely because they're short of men. I'm not really a Turtle Dove type of person. And they do sing a few American folk songs and this kind of thing as well. I don't recall any sea shanties, though. So anyway, there's no reference to Keiichi Kurosawa in that poem, and no evidence that he sang in the Tokyo Madrigal Club. But what seems to have happened is that he was playing in the college string quartet, and the college string quartet was playing some early music. So they played a piece of Purcell in the Trinity May Week concert in 1927. But in 1928, the two groups, the string quartet and the Madrigal group, joined forces. And they did tours. I think this was really the Madrigal group was doing a tour to Sweden in the Easter holidays in 1928, and then to Germany in the summer. Those of you who sing will know it's quite common, you don't want to be singing for an entire concert. So you have an organist or someone who can play something to give you a rest in between the singing bits. And I think that was the role of the string quartet. So they were taken along to give the singers a rest. Presumably they stuck to Purcell and the like during those tours. But I think Kurosawa was playing in the quartet and not singing. But one evening in Uppsala in Sweden, one of the tenors lost his voice. And Kurosawa, who of course was a great musician and a great sight reader, said, I'll stand in if you like and sing the tenor part. So that's how he became involved in madrigals. And of course, he heard the concerts of these madrigals all the time. So he returned to Japan in 1929, and thereafter, of course, his main activities were his family's typewriter business. But he was, throughout his life, a very, very enthusiastic amateur musician with a particular focus on Baroque or early music. He actually took several recorders back to Japan when he left Cambridge, probably bought from Dolmetsch, who was making these recorders down in Haslemere. And apparently they were the first recorders to arrive in Japan. I found an article in an American magazine called American Recorder. It's a bit niche, but there's an article in 2010 in that magazine which refers to these recorders and says they were the first to arrive in Japan. But actually Kurosawa doesn't seem to have touched them much until after the war. When he got back to Japan, Kurosawa founded the Tokyo Madrigal Singers, and he also founded an orchestra, a small string orchestra, which was called the Tokyo Polyphonic Orchestra. And so these became the vehicles for his music-making activities. I'm going to talk more about the Madrigal Society, partly because I know more about it, but it also is still going, whereas the Tokyo Polyphonic Orchestra disappeared into the mists of history quite a long time ago. But the Tokyo Polyphonic Orchestra was apparently the first group in Japan to perform Bach's Brandenburg Concertos 2 and 3, and it was performing Vivaldi and so on. So this was one of the very first groups to be performing this kind of music in Japan. The Tokyo Madrigal Singers were always defiantly amateur, and this was very much part of Kurosawa's philosophy, that music for him, and of course he was an amateur himself, music was about friendship, companionship, as much as it was about actual musical excellence. So the Tokyo Madrigal Singers never had any auditions. Essentially, almost anybody could join. And when I sang in it, there were certainly some people who who were passengers, I would say, and didn't really know what they were doing. But the whole ethos of madrigals is precisely that. It's friends getting together around the kitchen table, as it were, and singing together. And that was Kurosawa's ideal. And the early meetings were typically held at Kurosawa's family house. And he also saw the madrigal group as a way to maintain his links with the UK. So it was heavily associated with the British Embassy, and also in the post-war period with the British Council, which wasn't founded in Japan until 1953. And if I look at a program of one of the early concerts in 1930, in fact, Keiichi Kurosawa was the only Japanese person singing in it at that point. So the others were mostly sort of British Embassy related people. In particular, there was a man called Norman Braine, later Sir Norman Braine, who was said to be a very accomplished musician. And he produced an arrangement of an English folk song, Waly Waly, for this group. And this continues to be the kind of theme song of the Tokyo Madrigal Singers even today. So traditionally, it's sung at the end of every meeting while they're actually putting the teacups away and that kind of thing. Everybody knows it from memory. And Keiichi wrote in the program for that concert, recently music has become very popular, but most of what is performed is restricted to music of the 18th century and later. We feel that it is also very interesting to listen to earlier madrigals from the period of Queen Elizabeth and Shakespeare. If this small initiative by us fans of the period can help to introduce early English madrigals, folk songs and dances, we will be very happy. And indeed, he did introduce those to a Japanese public. They gave regular public performances. In particular, they were known for a Christmas concert, which took place every year for many, many years, even when UK-Japan relations deteriorated during the Second World War. The madrigal group kept going almost like secretly during the war. Some of the music was stored at the British Embassy. Some of it was stored in universities which had a sort of Christian tradition, like Sophia, Rikkyo, Aoyama Gakuin, where some of the members of the madrigal group were foreigners who taught at these universities. The embassy itself closed in 1941 after the outbreak of war. So I imagine that the meetings, they seem to have rotated between the universities, but they did actually keep going through the war. But I think they had to keep a pretty low profile. But then after the war, culture was one of the main ways in which relations were rebuilt between Japan and the West. I mean, another person I've been interested in is the poet Edmund Blunden, who was brought over by the British Embassy to try and rebuild things through literature. But similarly, Keiichi Kurosawa was rebuilding links through his musical activities. And various other musicians turned up at around this time who all became quite influential, and they all became friends of Keiichi Kurosawa. And I'm not going to mention most of them at much length, but one who is particularly interesting was a German harpsichordist. Her name was Margareta Harisch-Schneider. She's normally known as Etta because it's a rather long name. And actually, if I can move my shared screen a little bit, there's a book being published about her. So don't know if you can see that. Can you still see my screen? Yeah, okay. So Hitler's harpsichordist, The Passionate Life and something like the Troubled Times of Etta Harisch-Schneider. That was just published last month. So I haven't got it yet, but I would like to. I'm trying to get back to my PowerPoint presentation. Anyway, it doesn't greatly matter, but Etta turned up in Japan in 1941, and there's a little bit of it's difficult to pin down whether Etta was on Hitler's side or not, if you see what I mean. According to the book that's just been published, or at least the blurb about it, she was closely associated with Hitler and was sent on a kind of goodwill mission to Japan. But the story that was being told in Japan by the Kurosawa family was rather different. It was that she had been opposed to Hitler and was sacked as a result from her job teaching in Berlin. And so had sort of come to Japan to get away from all of that. Etta Harish Schneider, by the way, wrote an autobiography of her own, but apparently it's full of lies, basically. So it's difficult to know what to believe, and she's a rather strange character. She brought with her 2 harpsichords and a clavichord, another early keyboard instrument. I don't think these were the first harpsichords ever seen in Japan, because some foreign performers had actually brought harpsichords with them when they had come on tours. But they were the first to reside in Japan, if you see what I mean. And in fact, one of those 2 harpsichords of Etta's is still in the Kurosawa house in Denyen-chofu today. And indeed, I was playing it earlier this year. The other harpsichord, sadly, was destroyed during the war. So when Etta arrived in 1941, Keiichi Kurosawa and his son Hiroshi went to meet her at Yokohama to meet her ship, because they'd been requested by the German embassy to help her. And she stayed in Japan from 1941 until 1949. She taught harpsichord to Japanese students, but she also researched Japanese music, particularly early Japanese music. And she had a great interest in gagaku, which we'll come back to later. She published a book in 1973. So after she left Japan, she moved back to the States, where she became an academic. And she published a book called The History of Japanese Music in 1973. So she became quite an expert. And she used to visit the Kurosawas every Friday evening. And she would eat with them and then play music together with them after dinner. One of her other claims to fame is that some of you may have heard of the legendary spy Richard Sorger, a German journalist. I think Ian Fleming described him as the greatest spy ever. But he was in Japan during the war, spying for the Russians, in fact. And Etta Harish Schneider, who had a rather colorful love life, was one of the lovers of this spy. And so again, I'm not quite sure what to believe about this. Apparently, she knew that he was anti-Hitler and what he was up to. So you could imagine if they were both anti-Hitler, they could have been kind of, you can see why they would have got together. But the other possibility that occurs to me is that if she herself was some kind of spy, she may have actually learnt about his activities and been partly responsible for his subsequent capture, because he was uncovered and tortured and executed in 1944 by the Japanese authorities. So, we all need to buy this new book, Hitler's Harpsichordist, and find out a bit more about what exactly she was up to. But Etta collaborated and performed with lots of other Japanese musicians who went on to become major figures in early music. And she was also associated with Yamada Kosaku, another friend of the family. So Yamada Kosaku is one of Japan's most famous Western-style composers. He's mainly known for his children's songs, which include things like Akatombo. They're sung in school, so that means red dragonfly in English, and Karatachi no Hana. So these are fairly simple songs, mostly aimed at like primary school children. But I subsequently realized, in fact, I taught Yamada Kosaku's daughter English for a period in the early 90s. And I've forgotten how that came about, but I must have been introduced to her, I think, by the Kurosawa family when she was looking for an English teacher. So Etta was also responsible in a way for the first harpsichords to be manufactured in Japan. There was a Japanese guy called Momose Shoji who was really a piano tuner, but he made a copy of Etta's harpsichord. And actually, Japan now has quite a strong niche tradition of making harpsichords. So that's Etta Harish Schneider. There was another key figure was Leo Trainer, who was another good friend of the Kurosawa family. He was an American, and he arrived after the war in 1946, working as a civilian advisor to the US military. And he was obviously another good musician. He played the piano, he played the recorder, and he also took an interest in Japanese traditional instruments. And apparently Keiichi Kurosawa advertised in the newspaper, in the Japan Times, for recorder players, because I suppose he'd had these recorders since the 1920s, but nobody to play them with, apart from his own son, as you can see in the picture. And so he advertised to try and find players. And so he came across Leo Trainer, and they did a concert in 1949 with the Kurosawas. If I can move on to my next slide, if I can just make this work. There is, I mean, these photos, I'm afraid, are terribly grainy. I'll just make them full screen. But that photograph on the left shows a broadcast which was actually on American Forces radio services in 1951. So there's a 5-piece recorder group there, including Keiichi Kurosawa on the left, and then Hiroshi Kurosawa is in the middle, that's the son, and Leo Trainer on the far right. And Leo Trainer also became a regular with the Tokyo Madrigal Singers. And Trainer, together with the Kurosawas, had an important impact in terms of the recorder, because the recorder is quite widely used in Japanese schools as a tool for music education, as indeed it certainly used to be in UK schools. I don't know whether it still is. And the person who's credited with that is often a man called Sakamoto Yoshitaka. So he learned the recorder in Germany, and he played it on NHK in Japan in 1941. He seems to have been keen to use it as an educational tool, but obviously during the war, the Japanese authorities were, had other fish to fry and were not too worried about things like music education. But once the war ended and Leo Trainer was advising the American military, he was in a good position to push things like the recorder in the education system. So in 1950, he got Keiichi and Hiroshi Kurosawa to give a lunchtime demonstration concert of the recorder at the Ministry of Education. And they performed early music by composers including Purcell and Telemann. And a few months later, the Ministry of Education did take the decision to introduce the recorder into the primary school curriculum. So I think that the Kurosawas can certainly be credited with that. And so Leo Trainer, in fact, unlike Etta, continued to live in Japan until 1983. So he was around for a long time and had a big influence. He's perhaps most associated with the viola da gamba. He was the joint founder of the Viola da Gamba Society of Japan in 1973. And so previously the Madrigal group had been meeting at the Kurosawa's house, but Trainer also used to do a lot of stuff at his house. He was pretty well paid because he was working for the American authorities in the post-war period. And so his get-togethers were called Unagi no Kai, the eel group. And they used to meet regularly. And apparently they were called that because he used to order unagi don, eel on rice for everybody as their meal when they got together. Yeah, because the yen was very cheap in those days against the US dollar, he was perfectly happy to buy dinner for everybody. So no doubt the Kurosawas were regulars at those events. Another contribution made by the Kurosawas was to do with sheet music. Nowadays you can find it all on the internet, but when you were trying to perform Baroque music in Japan in the early years, it would have been very hard to get hold of actual sheet music. And Keiichi Kurosawa brought back a real trove of sheet music from Cambridge in the 1920s. And that became an important resource for people who were interested in this kind of music. So for instance, Tatsuo Minagawa, who founded a group called the Medieval Music Choir in 1952, he was regularly round at the Kurosawa's house when he was a student to consult all the resources that were there. In terms of madrigals, if you want to sing madrigals in Japan and you go to a music shop such as Yamaha in the Ginza, which by the way is almost opposite the Kurosawa headquarters on the main drag in Ginza, you'll find that the books of madrigals used in Japan are all edited by Keiichi Kurosawa. And I actually have them here. So he published these 3 volumes called the Madrigal Singers, volumes 1, 2, and 3. They were published in around 1958 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Tokyo Madrigal Singers, but they're still, I believe, in print today and are the standard volumes for anybody singing madrigals in Japan. So that's all about madrigals. And I just want to, again, this is a terrible photograph, or at least a terrible reproduction of the photograph, but I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the Kurosawas at the time of Benjamin Britten's trip in 1956. So Benjamin Britten only visited Japan once with his partner, Peter Pears, in 1956, and only for about 10 days. But it was quite an important visit for Britain. He was kind of looking for new directions in his music, and he went on an extended trip, which also included visiting a lot of other countries. And he went to Bali in Indonesia, and this gave him lots of new ideas. The main Japanese effect was Benjamin Britten's opera Curlew River, which is very closely based on the No play Sumidagawa, which Britten saw while he was in Japan. So I'm not quite sure how the visit to Japan started, but it seems that Sir Norman Braine again was involved, the musician at the British Embassy. He'd started out as an interpreter at the British Embassy in the 20s when he first came across Kurosawa. Later, he was the British consul in Kobe at the time when war broke out. And then he returned to be deputy ambassador in Japan for a period in the 1950s. But I think he just left by the time Britten and Piers actually arrived. He was probably involved in helping to set up their trip. So Britten and Piers performed 2 concerts in Japan, which were both broadcast live on NHK radio and television. Of course, Keiichi Kurosawa was quite involved with NHK. He knew all the people there and was often on NHK commenting on particularly early or British music. And it seems that Keiichi Kurosawa kind of took Britten and Piers in hand and showed them round while they were in Japan. And Hiroshi, whom I knew well, was actually the driver during this visit. And while he was in Japan, Britten went to see No play, the No play Sumidagawa twice. He was fascinated by it. He went to see Kabuki, and he also went to see Gagaku, the ancient court music. And it seems to have been Hiroshi Kurosawa who fixed up the trip to the Imperial Palace to see Gagaku. In fact, Hiroshi also fixed up for me to see Gagaku some years later, and I actually wrote a review for the Asahi Evening News. At that time, I used to write regular concert reviews for the Asahi Evening News in the early 90s. So the Kurosawas were very heavily involved with this trip. Now you can hear the impact of the Gagaku in Curlew River, Britten's opera, especially towards the beginning. The organ part is using exactly the chords of the sho, the ancient Japanese instrument that is used in Gagaku. And Britten was very interested in this instrument. So he actually asked if he could get hold of a sho for himself. So the Kurosawas bought him one in Kyoto. And well, so I just want to show you these photographs, actually. So before I move on, I mean, it's very grainy, but you can see Britten and Piers, or if you could see the photograph better, you would be able to see Britten and Piers singing here in the Tokyo Madrigal Singers with Keiichi Kurosawa conducting. On this occasion, by the way, one of the madrigals they sang was John Wilby's piece, which is called Sweet Honey-Sucking Bees. And so the musicians among you may know that. It actually has 2 parts, the madrigal, but for some reason, Keiichi Kurosawa only had the music for the first part. So when they got to the end of the first part, Peter Piers sort of carried on singing and said, where's part 2? But they didn't have the music for that. So Peter Piers sent that to them after they got home. And in return for the show, which this is Britten and Piers at a geisha house in Kyoto, where they heard more Japanese music, by the way, and they also borrowed the Japanese instruments, the shamisen. So Britten started playing the shamisen apparently, and Piers was singing to imitate the Japanese music. I don't know how good that was. But this is Britten playing the sho. So it's a kind of like a panpipes type of, but it's more metal, isn't it? The sho. And I think that's Keiichi Kurosawa on the left with him. And again, a little bit difficult to see, but this photograph is taken at Haneda Airport when Britten was just about to depart Japan, and he's carrying the sho under his arm there. It's obviously wrapped up, but it wasn't the sort of thing you want to put in the luggage. So he took it on as hand luggage, and there he's again talking to Keiichi Kurosawa as he leaves Japan. And in return for the show, Benjamin Britten sent the Kurosawas a recorder. It was actually a Dolmetsch-made recorder, and it had his initials BB scratched onto it. And well, I've seen that recorder. And in fact, I was talking to Hiroshi Kurosawa's widow earlier this year. She says she's not quite sure what she's done with it. For a while, it was on display at the museum at Musashi no Music College in Western Tokyo. But she said they'd got it back from there. So it must be in the house somewhere. But they aren't too sure where it is. Just returning to the show, by the way, obviously Britten was given the instrument, but he didn't know how to play it. So Leo Trainer wrote a kind of essay for him, how to play the show. It was entitled A Young Britain's Guide to the Show. As again, some of the musicians among you may recognize this as a reference to Britten's famous piece, A Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, which is one of his better known pieces. So this was quite an important trip for Britten and did result in his opera Curly River. It took about 8 years for Curly River actually to appear. So in fact, this year is the 60th anniversary of the first performance of Curly River, and it's been back again. They were performing it at the Aldeburgh Festival last month. And in fact, the No play on which it is based, Sumidagawa, was also performed at the Aldeburgh Festival with a troupe that came over specially. So Keiichi Kurosawa was eventually made an MBE, or honorary MBE, in 1976 for his contribution to Anglo-Japanese relations through music. He stood down from the Tokyo Madrigal Singers in 1978 and passed it to his son, Hiroshi. So that's the person that I knew. But after that, the Madrigal group, although it has continued, has sort of struggled a bit. It used to rehearse in the British Council library. The British Council closed its library. There was a difficulty about where to rehearse and where to store all the music as well. For a while, they were rehearsing at the British School, but it's sort of bounced around Tokyo a bit in recent years, and most of the members are pretty elderly these days. Especially, it's been quite difficult to get a hold of any male singers. So I think it's become almost more about the tea and biscuits these days than it is about the actual singing. But if you look at early music more generally in Japan, I would say Japan has a thriving early music scene. Probably the best known group is Bach Collegium Japan, which is very internationally well known. But there are loads of really top quality Japanese early musicians. I went to a concert which was actually Simon Standage, the Baroque violinist, was doing some concerts in Japan a few years ago, and he did a concert with a group of Japanese friends, as it were. And the Japanese Baroque musicians were fantastic and fully able to stand up there with Simon Standage. So I think Japan these days has a great strength in Baroque music, and this really stands as Keiichi Kurosawa's legacy. So that's the end of my talk, and very happy to answer any questions. This is, by the way, is the No play, Sumidagawa, that Britten saw. And that is Curly River, the opera that he based on it, with Peter Pears singing the main part. So I will stop sharing my screen. Yeah, and happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That was enormously deep, and I wasn't aware of your very deep engagement in the Japanese music world from this perspective. One question which you may have noticed when the title which I announced is a little bit different than the title you gave me. And so I want to turn that into my first question is, you said early music in Japan. Now I turned this into only Western music, no? Because there must be early music in Japan long before, probably, like the court music you mentioned. Maybe you can tell a little bit about the differences, which probably developed independently for some time, no? Until people like Kurosawa and you came along, and others, of course, who brought, in painting also, like about 100 years ago, there was a lot of cross-fertilization. So if you could talk a little bit about both, well, you talked about the cross-fertilization, but like what was the state of music before that exposure
Yeah, I mean, Japan, of course, has a long tradition of its own music, or what's usually called hogaku in Japanese. And And I suppose it goes back, well, like Western music, it goes back originally to religious ceremonies as well. So gagaku is one of the earliest forms that was actually imported from the Chinese court, along with everything else Chinese that was imported around 600 or that sort of period. And of course that's died out in China years and years, I mean centuries ago, but it survives in Japan, and also I discovered in Vietnam a version of it still survives. But then after that you have of course music at festivals, a lot of it associated with rice planting or rice harvests, things like no plays, which you could consider to be more operas than plays. They have a little orchestra, two drums and a flute. But that kind of music goes back to earlier forms such as sarugaku, which was a kind of it's what no plays developed out of. So there was a long tradition of music in Japan. I mean, later in more like the Edo period, you have things like the shamisen coming in, and some of those things like kabuki and bunraku, also associated with those kinds of music. But they are very, very different from Western music, and so much so that I find it rather hard to believe in Britten and Piers successfully performing Japanese style music in a geisha house. I mean, Britten was a viola player, and but the idea that he could just pick up a shamisen and what did Peter Piers do with the words? I struggle to believe in this geniuses that I'm sure they were. I doubt it was very similar.
Well, looking at the pictures, maybe some sake helped along.
Yeah. There is a story actually that Peter Piers picked up a small waste paper bin and turned it upside down and was doing the sort of no drumming, on the waste paper bin. So yeah, as you say, a bit of sake may have been involved. Yeah, but there was no Western music in Japan really until the 1850s. Well, one thing that I have heard, which I'm not at all sure if it's true, but of course, some of the early foreigners who came to Japan in around 1600 presumably may have brought some music with them. And I was told by people in Izu that some of the sea shanties in that area contain snatches of English language in them. Some people have told me they simply don't believe this story, but the people in Izu insist that that is the result of William Adams, the first Englishman in Japan who arrived in 1600, who built seagoing ships in Izu. So he, according to the Izu people, he must have taught the sailors some of the shanties that he would have known. But essentially, apart from a few very niche things like that, there wouldn't have been any Western music in Japan at all until the 1850s. But then it started to be introduced quite rapidly because, for instance, Japan needed things like a national anthem. So the first music for the Japanese national anthem was actually written by an Irish bandmaster called John Fenton. And you can hear some of his music still in the current version of the Japanese national anthem, but it's been changed. Yeah, but I mean, they're so different, Japanese and Western musical traditions, that I think in a way there's very little overlap. And if you look at Britten's music after his visit to Japan in 1956, you can't really detect any actual Japanese musical instruments or musical influences apart from the gagaku, which of course is originally Chinese anyway. But the gagaku fits more easily into a kind of Western framework with, the sort of notes you could play on a piano. But traditional Japanese music, doesn't have the same kind of scale at all. So it's really quite difficult to even write it down using Western notation.
Okay. Susie, why don't you, if you have questions,
well,
why don't you go
the
ahead?
first thing to say was that was utterly riveting. And it brings to mind a conversation I've had recently with Nicholas Kenyon. I don't know if you know that he's working on a book on the revival of early choral music and the history of performance practice. And one question I would have is performance practice and how this style of singing has developed and changed since the 20s in Cambridge and with the Tokyo Madrigal Singers, and to what extent there might be recordings available to track this development. I'd be absolutely fascinated to know how they sang, whether they sang exclusively one voice per part, as tends to be the tradition with small groups of who are performing madrigals. Whether you had any comments along those lines?
Well, they didn't sing one to a part. I mean, essentially, it's a group of amateurs getting together for fun. I mean, it's very important to bear in mind it is an amateur group. And they did some public concerts, but they were really just singing for fun. So in that first concert, I think I mentioned there were 10 performers in the 1930 concert. Most of the music they sing would be in 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 parts. So they must have been doubling up the parts. And that certainly has been the case throughout the period when I have sung with them. They would often have 20, 25 people singing. A lot of doubling of the parts. And as I said, a few of the singers were definitely passengers and needed somebody solid singing the same line. And also in terms of style, I think it's fair to say that even today, certainly some of the members, are still singing in a very old-fashioned style with a lot of vibrato, for instance. So, and I think that's probably generally true of Japanese classical singers. There's probably more vibrato in Japanese singing than has become typical in the West these days. So it's a bit unreconstructed, you might say, in that sense. But then, groups like Bach Collegium Japan are, very much part of the whole global, early music scene, and they, and they perform in the same way that you'd expect.
Absolutely.
Gardner to perform or something like that. Yeah.
Is there a recording of the 1930 concert?
No, I don't think so. But you can find a couple of things on YouTube if you Google Tokyo Madrigal Singers. So there is a very brief record. I think it was, well, not an LP, but a shorter record that they released sometime in the 1950s with a couple of songs on it. Sadly, neither of them are actually madrigals, I think. Actually, no, maybe it's got 6 pieces, but it's a Christmas concert, so there are a lot of Christmas carols. But there are a couple of other things, and I'm sure that others will emerge because they did perform on television and things occasionally. In fact, one of my outings as the Turtle Dove, I think, was part of a Japanese television program some years ago. As you know, Susie, I'm really an alto, so I shouldn't have been singing, the Turtle Dove.
Tenor.
Well, yeah, but I guess they thought my pronunciation of the words would probably be better than most of the other members.
I'm sure you did it beautifully.
Yeah,
we
have style leaders, I would say, in terms of early music style.
We have a number of other people who might be interested to ask questions. Francis, would you be interested to ask a question? Francis, can you ask to unmute? Francis, are you here?
Hello.
Hello. Would you be interested to ask a question, maybe?
Yeah, sorry, I just unmuted myself when you were unmuting me, so I think we cancel each other out. No, thank you very much for the tour, Jason. It was very, very interesting, particularly hearing about Britain and Peter Pose's time in Japan. I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the sort of kabuki traditions. It was something I was quite interested in you talking about in one of your responses.
Francis,
just a moment.
Could you introduce yourself in a second, maybe? Because I think you're not Trinity member, I think. So just 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry, I'm here under invite from Susie, actually. So I've just come along to have a listen. But yeah, I'm a composer and choral director. So based near where Susie is in Bath, just outside Bath. So, but yeah, sorry, Jason. Yeah.
Well, so Kabuki is really associated with the Edo period, which is like 1603 to 1868. During that period, Edo, which we now call Tokyo, was the capital, well, the effective capital of Japan, where the shogunate was based. And Japan was at peace and really flourished. And during that time, you had a great growth in a kind of townspeople culture. So Edo, in fact, became the largest city in the world for a chunk of time around then, with a population of around 1 million. So it was the largest city in the world until it was overtaken by London, I think, in the 19th century. So huge market for entertainment of all kinds. And Kabuki, well, Kabuki dates back a little earlier than that, but it really flourished in that period, particularly around the 1700s. It's considered to be the sort of peak time for Kabuki. And it's a very spectacular style of theatre with sort of lots of warriors and you know, battles and acrobatics. And yeah, I remember seeing one amazing Kabuki play where it ended with a ghost who flew across the top of the stage, hanging from some sort of wire, while fireworks exploded. It was amazing. So you know, Kabuki is very spectacular, and the music for Kabuki, it's mostly sort of shamisen and singing. So the shamisen is a kind of 3-stringed guitar, which has quite a sort of pungent sound. And along with Kabuki, there's another form of theatre which is rather similar, which is bunraku. So bunraku and Kabuki often, they do the same plays, but bunraku is for puppets. And the advantage of puppets is they can do even more spectacular acrobatics and things than actual people can. But there's a big overlap between those two, and the music and the plays are largely the same. So Kabuki, Britain and peers were very impressed by Kabuki. If you're interested in this topic, by the way, there's this book I have, Britain and the Far East, which was written by my old friend Mervyn Cook. Mervyn is professor of music at, I think, Nottingham University. And so he was actually a postgraduate student at King's when I was an undergraduate there. And he wrote his PhD thesis about Benjamin Britten's involvement with the Far East. And so I introduced him to Hiroshi Kurosawa, and I translated some material. And so I get an acknowledgement in this book. But in there, they do describe the visit they made to Kabuki and how it's, you know, it's much more approachable than No. It's a lot of fun, actually. You know, I think Peter Pears was very impressed by Kabuki, but in the end, it was No that had the bigger influence on Britain. I think because it is so different, it really introduced him to a completely different concept of what a theatrical performance could be. But Kabuki, you know, if you go to Japan, it remains reasonably popular. So it's not that inaccessible. And they also used to have, I think they stopped it during COVID, but they used to have an English language audio guide. So you could have this thing in your ear explaining what was going on in English. Obviously, during COVID, it was impossible to travel to Japan. And I'm not completely confident that the English language audio guide has been revived subsequently, but it's certainly a great help, you know, if it is going.
Is it mainly pentatonal?
Yes, I think that's correct. I'm going to get out of my depth if I talk a lot about Japanese music, but I think that, again, there's some discussion of it in the book by Mervyn. I think you're right. I think it is pentatonal. There's also, you can find on the Daiwa Foundation's website, but we had a talk relatively recently given by somebody called Simon Cosgrove, who is actually a jazz pianist in Tokyo, but he's one of our former scholars, and he was talking about the Japanese national anthem, and there's some detail he gives there about the different Japanese scales and, you know, different styles of Japanese music. So if you look on our website, you can find a recording of his talk, I think.
But going back to this fashion of madrigal singing way back in the 20s, which I find really interesting, it's still difficult to get sheet music. And notoriously. But how would they have accessed, who would have done the research? How would have they accessed publications? this type of thing must have been quite a challenge.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the sheet music that you see for this sort of thing, especially if it's individual pieces, it does actually date back to this sort of period. And I think there were people, people like E.H. Fellows, was he? Quite a lot of were kind of unearthing these pieces and publishing them. So I presume that was the main source of music. But as you say, certainly before then, I don't know what they would have done. And I suppose that sort of explains these glee clubs, is that they had their own libraries of this music that they kept. Otherwise it wouldn't have been possible to maintain.
Do you think Cambridge would have, that this group in Cambridge would have had better access to this material than anywhere else in the UK?
Well, I don't know about than anywhere else, but Cambridge would certainly have had an advantage. You had scholars researching this music. You would have had collections. I mean, for instance, I'm sure Trinity, well, I know Trinity has a wonderful library. I don't know how much you have music in it, but King's has a kind of separate music section for its library. Of course, it's mainly sacred music because it's associated with the chapel, but it wouldn't surprise me to find that they have things like madrigals in there as well, from the time when people were originally performing them.
And it would be interesting to do a comparative study of the emerging trends in terms of performance in London, in other centres, and whether Kurosawa was actually, a real pioneer in this respect in the UK.
I don't think Kurosawa could really be credited with any original research or anything like that. I'm pretty sure that he just took copies of music that he got off his friends at Trinity or off the Dolmet family, and he seems to have bought quite a substantial amount of music while he was in the UK. I mean, I've sort of rooted through his cupboards in the house in Daein Chofu, and I mean, there's a very big collection of music, a lot of it really old, and also things like dictionaries of music and musical reference material, and by no means all singing music. Of course, there's lots of like harpsichord music and scores of Brandenburg concertos and stuff. He obviously was collecting all of that stuff when he was at Cambridge in the 1920s.
Did he read? What did he read at Trinity?
He read this degree called Moral Sciences, and I have to say I'm not too sure what exactly Moral Sciences was.
Might be maybe called ethics today, probably.
Maybe. Yeah, but I doubt it.
Michael Banner. We have to ask Michael Banner. He will know maybe.
But I don't think it had anything to do with music.
Shall we ask Susanna? She is a Trinity alumna, and Susanna?
Come on, Susanna, let's see you. So Susanna's an old school friend of mine, by the way.
Oh, really? Oh, that's why she's here. Susanna? Oh, wait a sec.
She's gone off.
Well, I think it's with this unmute issue. Hello, Susanna.
Oh, God, you're outside.
Repointing a wall while listening. I haven't actually got any specific questions. It's just all been very interesting. Very interesting indeed. And congratulations on your OBE, which I didn't know about.
Oh, right. Oh, thank you.
Congratulations.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this summer, was it the summer list or the birthday list, or?
I think it was last summer. Yeah.
Oh, last summer, a year ago. Okay.
OBE4. What's the site?
The services to UK-Japan relations. So this is what we're doing now, right?
Well deserved.
Thank you very much.
Okay. If
weather where you are, Susanna.
Anybody else questions? Tim, maybe.
That's why I'm making the most of it.
Tim. Hello, Tim. I think you know each other.
Hello. Well, yeah. I wasn't at Trinity, but I wasn't far away. I was at St. John's, and I was also one of the passengers occasionally with the Tokyo Madrigal Singers, as Jason.
Tim, you certainly were not one of the passengers.
Well, actually, I was a choral scholar at St. John's, so probably I wasn't. I'm sorry, I came in halfway through, but you probably talked about this before I joined, but I was under the impression that the Tokyo Madrigal Singers no longer existed. And I seem to remember going to what was billed as their final concert. So what are they doing? Who resurrect?
Yeah, it's sort of on the verge. I actually wrote an article which you can find on the Daiwa Foundation website called something like, you know, the end of the Tokyo Madrigal Society. So they did have a kind of final concert.
Yeah.
And that was a few years ago. And I don't think there are likely to be any more concerts. But what seems to be happening is that some of the stalwarts still get together, you know, once a month or something like that. And in fact,
Drink 3 bottles of wine each.
well, it's only tea, sadly. Yeah, but
something
but
like
I was in Japan, well, as you know, because we had dinner together, but I was in Japan in March and April for a chunk of time, and I went to a meeting of them then. At the meeting I attended, there were, I think, only 6 people there, including me. And so I sang bass because they didn't have a bass. And the other male there sang tenor, but he himself was on a business trip from Thailand or something. So he can't normally be there. So it made me wonder what happens normally. I mean, I think it's quite likely it's just, you know, 4 or 5 women. So difficult to imagine that they can sing.
Okay, so in other words, they don't really exist anymore. And I did go to their final concert.
Right.
Okay,
but I looked up on the internet. I found a Facebook page for them, but I don't know what that means really in terms of activity.
I should mention, by the way, that so one of the people who was at that meeting is Kikuko Matsuda. You remember her, I think, Tim.
I do.
So she has been, she's part of a group called the Japan Early Music Research Association, and has done a lot of work on this whole issue. She's actually published several articles in Japanese magazines. So I ought to credit her with, you know, a lot of the information that I have used, actually. She's partly behind this.
I see.
Jason, were you, in 1980, were you singing in the Tokyo Magical Singers? In Tokyo?
Not in 1980, no. I first lived in Japan in 1983, and that's when I started singing with them.
So in 1980, I spent a year in the Philippines, and I was at that time singing with the Philippine Magical Singers, which has a very interesting history. And I was the only non-Filipino, Filipina member of the group. And it's actually developed into a very serious choir that tours internationally. So quite an interesting comparison. Yes, and they do very few madrigals now, I think.
Yeah, I think to be honest, one thing that may have happened is I think Keiichi Kurosawa was a really strong musician. And I think his son, Hiroshi, you know, hadn't had the same kind of training. So he perhaps wasn't as effective as a director of it. And then especially when Hiroshi stood down, there was a man called Suzuki-san who was pretty good, who sang tenor and also played the recorder. And I assumed that he would take over at some point. But he had various family crises and didn't. So, you know, once Hiroshi stood down, there wasn't really anybody kind of in charge anymore. And that's been a problem, I think. And Matsuda-san lives in Akashi in Western Japan. So she's not, you know, around in Tokyo all the time.
Okay. If there's any more questions, Susie, Tim, Francis.
Well, I do think you should, it would be very interesting. Do you know Nicholas Kenyon, Jason?
I'm trying to think whether I've met him. I know the name anyway.
Yeah. So his book on early music, the revival of early music, choral music specifically, it would be great for him to meet you and deepen his knowledge.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much Japan would contribute to the broader history.
No, the early movement in the 20s in the UK. I just think that's very interesting.
Well, he probably knows about it already, but there is a book which I've got somewhere in my house, which was called A History of Music at Cambridge. So it's specifically looking at some of these things as well. But you had all those people like, you know, Vaughan Williams, a part of them, they were writing music for instance, the Cambridge Greek play. You know, that we have this thing.
I go to it every 2 years,
Yeah. So I think it was Vaughan Williams who wrote music for the Wasps, for instance.
Yes.
So yeah, there were a lot of quite major figures involved in Cambridge. I mean, not necessarily early music, but people like Stanford as well.
From our college, Queen's.
Was Stanford at Queen's?
Yes.
Okay, jolly good.
I know Trinity likes to claim Stanford, but he's actually Queen's man. He spent time at both.
I can't forget our lunch you invited me for. That was amazing at Queen's. No?
I don't think.
Any more discussion questions? Then thank you so much, everyone, and see you soon again.
Yeah, well, thank you all very much for
very much,
and
yeah,
especially thank you, Jason, for this really amazing. I was really surprised by the depth in which you are active in this field. This is really amazing. I didn't expect this depth at all, really, because I thought with your Daiwa Foundation, after you have so many other things to do, I was thinking.
Well, no, yeah, music and Japan. It's that those are my two big interests in life, so they kind of intersect on this one.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, and I hope to see you again in Tokyo, Daiwa in London.
I'll be out in October, November.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thank you very much, everyone.